Super excited for this session. We will be talking about how you can build in integrations into your bot, and how some conversation design practices that you can follow while designing these journeys. A quick overview of the design process, a couple of minutes on this. I've broken down the whole process into this very skeletal structure of prepare, design, review, and a soft launch. Before I jump right in, I thought it'd be helpful to just define what an API is. So, very simply put, an API is an application programming interface. It's right. What it does is basically fetches information from a different or an external system. That's what an API does for you. It talks to an external system. And what is this external system? This external system could be a CRM. It could be a database where you should store all the information of customers. Now, types of APIs, I briefly mentioned this earlier, but you should know that there are roughly 4 categories of APIs and some operations that you can expect. So you have get APIs, which fetch, as the name suggests. Get fetches information or retrieves information from a certain type of system. Post creates or posts information into a system. Put, very similar to post, but the only difference between put and post is that post literally creates a new resource. So for example, if you had a lead generation bot which was collecting, we would collect a few pieces of information within the chatbot, and then you create or register a new customer in the database. You'd use the post API. And then you have put, which updates a resource, which is, for example, if someone comes in and says, I want to update my email address in their insurance claim, that you would use a put API. Patch and put are very similar. So patch is used to partially update a resource. Like if you only have to update, instead of updating an entire profile for a user, you only wanted to update 1 or 2 fields, you'd use patch. And then you have delete, which deletes a resource altogether. So when you're faced with APIs, you'll hear these terms often, like get, post API, delete, put, patch. So just so you're not very confused, this is it. There are these few categories of operations that you can expect. Now, there are some parts of an API documentation which will matter to you as a conversation designer. 3 actually. There's a request parameter, response parameter, and then you have your error cases or response types. There are a few steps that we follow to add an API to your design, right? There are 5 very, very simple steps. I'll break this down practically, but just giving you an overview before I go there. I'll now show you how you can add this to your design. Let's talk about how an API-based journey would actually be added to your design, and I'll practically show you this by designing one very quickly in front of you.